So what is this book about? As you said, I've been studying Bhakti in some way. It's 40 years now since I first came to Vrindavan, and the project that I'm involved in now is taking a second look at Vrindavan to see how it's changed in the course of that time. Very exciting work, actually, and might be disconcerting for many. As you may know, a 70-story tower, the tallest building in India, is projected for Vrindavan. So it is obviously going to change the face of that earth in remarkable ways. It will be taller than any building in Delhi. If it is built, it will be taller than any building in India. And in thinking about how tall it should be, the benchmark actually are the pyramids of Egypt. So here we're looking at a monument being created for Bhakti, you could say, and for a particular kind of Bhakti that illustrates, at least to me, the fact that this is a concept that is by no means dead. It's about to take over, or at least contribute to, in a powerful and very noticeable way, the modern landscape of India. So one can ask if one knows about such a thing. And by the way, my fieldwork yesterday was in Gurgaon. You've heard of Gurgaon? How many people have been to Gurgaon? Okay, we do have one or two dissenters in the room. Well, for me, it's been an amazing experience to go to Gurgaon, and I have to tell you, it's very close to a certain part of Vrindavan these days. And in fact, even in terms of how to make the journey best, Gurgaon is probably your best point of departure. So this is an amazing thing, the idea that you have this ancient Bhakti tradition being formalized, one could say, in such a way that it is accessible to Gurgaon and all that that stands for in modern India. But what's the background of this? How could one think about how we came to this kind of moment? Obviously, there's a lot to be said, and lucky for you, there's no time to say it today. But this book was in some way a kind of way to come up to that moment. So the idea of the Bhakti movement. I don't even know, actually, how, and Kunal, I'm thinking of you at this point, to what extent or how the notion of the Bhakti movement is now a part of the NCERT curriculum. I believe it survives, but it survives in a sort of multi-traditionalized fashion. Whereas at somewhat earlier moments, it was consolidated as a sense of the Bhakti movement, a singular entity. And I have the feeling that that sense of a singular entity actually still hangs over the NCERT texts. And in particular, it has sort of contributed to discussions about what those texts should be for medieval India at the point where political parties changed their control, exchanged control of the NCERT apparatus. So it's alive and well. In the civil service exams, still it's the case that it helps you to know something about the Bhakti movement as you go into those exams. What is this Bhakti movement? And since when have we had an idea that there is such a thing as the Bhakti movement? That was the question I was trying to answer with this book, and it took me some places that I had no idea it would take me. So, one place to start would be to go back to the year 2007, when I was 9 years ago, when I was invited to a conference in Tirupati. This was a conference, as those of you who have dipped into the book would know, this is a conference that was convened by the Tirumalai Tirupati Devasthanams in cooperation with the Indian Council of Philosophical Research. So I have to say that from an American point of view, oh Lord, from an American point of view, we have our troubles these days, and you know them well, but to think of the Tirumalai Tirupati Devasthanams acting together with, or let's say the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, getting together with the National Endowment for the Humanities to put together a conference that would bring together Americans of various religious stripes to talk about the common religious history of the nation. That would be quite something to imagine, and rather hard to imagine. But there it was in Tirupati. So what was the format? A national seminar on Bhakti in Indian tradition. So what do they say about Bhakti about the Bhakti movement? Just in case you forgot. The Bhakti movement in medieval India is responsible for the many rites and rituals associated. Well, sorry, we need a definition first. Where is that? Oh, they reference it to the Upanishads. God means different things to different people. Devotion to God, however, implies altruistic love and unselfish surrender to a higher purpose or being. In the Indian tradition, self-surrender through celestial love is recommended as a path to final emancipation of the person from existential suffering. Indeed. Then they go on to speak about the various expressions of it, and we have the intonation of the name Rahm Anand, for example, and Swami Vivekananda comes up on the next page. We also have mention of the fact that when Hawley is performed in North India, it's part of Bhakti. Okay, so this is this conference in Tirupati. It was a fascinating event to be at, and I gave a little bit of a presentation there on what I understood at that point about how the idea came into being and cited the name of Hazare Deveti and so forth. There was a bit of an uproar, actually. People objected on several fronts. One was that Firangi was saying anything about things like this, which is a reasonable objection, actually. Someone made the point that, foreigners shouldn't understand that after the model of the Peace of Westphalia, that it's a matter of, cuius regio, eius religio. It's not a matter of a king determining what a people should be. So, and then the most substantial response was from a woman who said, Bhakti is a matter of sadhana, and it's always there. So it's not really a matter of something that you can think of as a historical idea. So that was good response to get. But I still do believe that the idea of the Bhakti movement is an idea in time, and that because we are all people in time, I just invoked Gurgaon, because we're all people in time, it helps us to take cognizance of the fact that time plays a big role in our thoughts about where we are in time. That was something that wasn't particularly welcome at this conference at that moment in time. I'm hoping that with the book being out, maybe people will be willing to think about it in a different way. Let me say something about the title. It's called A Storm of Songs, and these are the words of Rabindranath Tagore. So you may not have associated him in your minds first and foremost with Bhakti, but let me read to you the poem from which I'm quoting. It's called Sweet Mercy. It was published in Harijan, Gandhi's journal, emerging from Pune, in 1933, and it was a merging. I'm not doing this just specially for the Bengalis in the room. It was a sort of merging of two earlier poems which Rabindranath had written in Bengali and merged for this occasion. So Gandhi has begun his fast for the ending of untouchability over there on the other side of the nation, and Tagore is contributing to the effort. It's a very interesting poem, and it focuses on the figure of Raidas, as he's called here. So listen to what Tagore says. You'll hear the phrase storm of songs toward the end. Raidas, the sweeper, well, there's so many places one could stop. When did sweeping become a general term for chamars? Raidas, the sweeper, was tanner by caste, whose touch was shunned by the wayfarers, and the crowded streets were lonely for him. Actually, there's Rabindranath for you. The crowded streets were lonely for him. How many times have I been through the streets of Vrindavan, let us say, in the last 5 days, and past sweepers who are in their own world. They're doing the work without which Vrindavan could not be, and yet the passerby traffic does not interact with them. Crowded streets were lonely for him. Master Rahm Anand was walking to the temple after his morning bath when Raidas bowed himself down before him from a distance. "Who are you, my friend?" asked the great Brahmin, and the answer came, "I am mere dust, dry and barren, trodden down by the despising days and nights. Thou, my master, art a cloud on the far-away sky. If sweet mercy," that's the title of the poem, "if sweet mercy be showered from thee upon the lowly earth, the dumb dust will cry out in ecstasy of flowers." Master took him to his breast, pouring on him his lavish love, which made a storm of songs to burst across the heart of Raidas, the sweeper. So I think it's actually quite a remarkable poem, situated in social reality, but also situated in time. The figure of Rahm Anand and Purushottam and I have a long-standing discussion about our common guru, Rahm Anand. The figure of Rahm Anand is, if there is one figure who signifies the movement of bhakti from south to north, it is the figure of Rahm Anand, who, as you doubtless know, is understood to have been a member of the Sri Sampradaya, so his lineage goes back to Ramanujacharya in the south, 11th, 12th century. So he's the link figure from the south to the north, and he's also a link figure in the imagery that is cast about him, because what's usually said, as you doubtless know, is that he fell into problems with the Sri Sampradaya because of his eating practices, which were not as well defined from a Brahminical point of view as would have been thought appropriate by the Sri Sampradaya. So this is the Brahmin who steps onto this street where Raidas is doing his work of sweeping. It's not just any old Brahmin, it is that Brahmin. And as the sense of Purushottam being in the room, as you would know, actually this is a kind of adaptation of the story of Rahm Anand's meeting Kabir on the steps of the Ghats in Benares, where that famous meeting was said then to have unleashed Kabir Bhakti in all of North India. And Purushottam still feels that there's a kernel of truth there. I am less confident, but we don't need to get into that at the moment, though he probably will. But the point is that this is an interreferential poem in several ways. It talks about south and north without ever saying so. It talks about the relationship between Kabir and all of this bhakti movement in the north without exactly saying so. And it certainly talks about the issue of social betterment as something that is intrinsically associated with bhakti. So and for the moment in time in which it was written, of course, it was the poem to be written. Now, you may feel that it's not a satisfactory poem. After all, what happens in this poem? I've often thought that maybe Rabindranath himself would know what it would be like to walk down the street as the presence that he was, and to encounter the lowly people who were around him. How would he respond to their wishes, let us say? So I think we can even see a little bit of Rabindranath himself walking into this poem. One may not be satisfied with what happens here. After all, Raidas, accepting this sort of from afar, being unwilling to go toward him and then waiting for the Guru to come to him, that's not satisfactory from a Dalit point of view or from any kind of socially conscious point of view. But something happens in this poem, and what happens is that when that moment occurs, when that happens, then is unleashed what's called here a storm of songs. And then we have to think about what a storm means in the Bengal setting. Okay, well, I won't go into that. There are people in the room who know that far better than I. But what is a storm? The reason that I think, for all the above reasons, I think that poem was a good way to start the book. At least I hope it was. And for one more, namely, that as we start, and then I'll just talk briefly about the design of the book. We start the first chapter of the book. It's called Bhakti and the Bhakti movement and its discontents. There are discontinuities that are built into the idea of the Bhakti movement, and I think that are constitutive, historically speaking, for the generation of the idea of the Bhakti movement. There's an important dialogue or dispute between English and Hindi here, and specifically between the way in which George Grierson, architect of the Linguistic Survey of India, was interpreted to speak in his very much read Hastings Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics article of 1910 on Bhakti Marga. There's a dispute between that framing of, let's call it the Bhakti movement for a moment, and what Hazare Prasad Dwivedi wanted to take away from it. My conviction is that despite some earlier writing, actually, Grierson did not use the term the Bhakti movement. It was not a single thing for him, but rather, to use his language, the four churches of the Reformation. Very interesting idea, which of course, now he's speaking primarily to Western listeners, so he wants them to be able to understand the stakes that are involved here. Four churches of the Reformation. And he is always searching he's struck, not just as a scholar, but as a person, I think, and as a religious person, struck by what he perceives to be the connections between Christian religiosity and history and Hindu So Grierson, over the course of 5 or 6 years, is trying to search out what could have happened in Indian history that could have registered Christian history as importantly as, to his perception, it did. And he talks about, oh my goodness, he talks about the Last Supper and Mahaprasad and so forth. And settles on the Nestorians. But the important point to take away here, I think, and talks about Bhakti as a revolutionary force in India focused around emotion. So he's seeing it as being something that has a sort of emotional core, but he never describes it as a movement as such. He describes its several parts instead. This is unsatisfactory to Hazare Prasad Dwivedi. Who is Hazare Prasad? You all know, but let's just mention that he's certainly one of the two greatest early literary critics who really created Hindi as a linguistic formation, such as we today know it. And it's he who comes up with the idea of the Bhakti movement before Ramchandra Shukla, who would be his competition for this title. It gets written into Ramchandra Shukla's Hindi Sahitya Ka Itihas, but only with the second edition of the book. The initial idea is Hazare Prasad's. So what Hazare Prasad doesn't like about Grierson, of course, is the fact that he's trying to find the Christian kernel that changed Indian religiosity into something that would be more like the way in which we would like to think about Christian history, especially Protestant history, I would say, and its transformative effects on society. Hazare Prasad doesn't like this for good reason, but in the course of not liking it, he says things about, Dr. Grierson ne kaha tha ki, and then he talks about this stroke of lightning that Grierson is looking for that happened in the course of Indian religious history. What strike of lightning could this be? It has to be the gospel of Jesus somehow, but how was it registered? Did it happen with the Nestorians? Was it with Kabir later on? He's never quite sure. Hazare Prasadji turns all of that away and says, look, we're talking about something very much like a monsoon, a storm of songs, to use my metaphor. A monsoon, and we know how monsoons build. Yes, there's a moment of sort of dramatic rainfall, but the monsoon has been building for a very long time. So in my view, it's Hazare Prasad who provides, for the first time, a convincing picture of Bhakti movement as a long developing monsoon, which then will finally shed its much desired rains on the Indian country. When? Well, probably in the Mughal period, in the period of Akbar, in the period of Kabir, and so forth. Some would say earlier. So I think it's significant that this debate takes place between that sort of iconic Orientalist and that iconic founder of Hindi literature. Significant from a historical point of view, but also from a linguistic point of view. Because it's the Hindi language, I would argue, that benefits the most from the idea of the Bhakti movement as it comes to be fully formed. Hindi is looking for its own ancestry at that point in time. We're just at the moment where Hindi Bhavan is going to be soon established at Shantiniketan, and Hazare Prasad Dwivedi will become the leader of that institution. Hindi is looking for its past. The nation is looking for a language like Hindi, which can be India-ish, Hindi. So all of these nationalist issues are, I think, involved in the shaping of the idea as we come to have it. These are some of the discontents, I would say, that signify the idea of the Bhakti movement from the beginning. And if we look at how the idea is put together, we see that it doesn't just exist in some way. It's actually put together in time. So then what's the shape of the book? Well, we get at this debate in chapter 1, and by the time we get to chapter 6, which isn't quite the last one, we're finally learning about Tagore and Hazare Prasadji, and we're learning about the fact that this idea about Hindi and its role in conceiving of, you could say even benefiting from the Bhakti movement, happens in a place that isn't actually a part of the Hindi heartland. It happens over there in Bengal, where history, of course, Hindi is being spoken, many Biharis around and so forth, but still we're at somewhat of a distance from, the capital has moved to Delhi by now. We're seeing Hindi itself as part of a national picture, as if we were somehow able to conceive it rather than living it on a day-to-day basis. Chapter 6, we get a sense of how that all happens in Bengal. The intervening chapters, I sometimes think it's, I don't know. Did you all have to learn Shakespeare? I know you went to English media schools. I'm guessing many of you went to India. Okay, we had to learn Shakespeare. And we were told that a Shakespearean drama proceeds in 5 acts. And those acts are, we get the discontents appear in the first act. And then we have the climax of action in the 3rd act, where something happens, where things are going to change. And then finally we move toward a solution or a denouement in Act 5, where everything finally gets solved and there's some surprises at the end, but it all gets solved in a nice way. Okay, so in sort of thinking about how this book might come to be, I'd hoped it would be some sort of Shakespearean drama where we'd get the discontents at the beginning and we'd have the solution at the end, and we'd have to see what happened in the middle. Okay, so how does that work? Chapter 1 is about discontents. Chapter 2 is the plot thickens. We get this idea of the transit of Bhakti from south to north, Utpanna, Dharvadeya, Saham, and so forth, associated with the Bhagavata Purana. Then, in the middle, we were going to have a chapter about these 4 churches of the Reformation, so to speak, the 4 sampradaya, Char Sampradaya, an idea that comes into India, I believe, in about 1600 with Nabadas, although there are competitors for this title. Then we have the Shantiniketan chapter, where things begin to arrive at the solution. And then the last chapter was going to be some sort of resolution about today and how we should think about this. It didn't turn out that way, folks, in 2 ways. First of all, there are 7 chapters in the book now. And the reason that happened is that this whole idea of the 4 sampradayas turned out to be rather more complicated than I had hoped. So we have in chapter 2, we have the idea of the Bhakti movement from south. So let's follow it through. So we begin with discontents, things are going to happen. Chapter 2, we get the great story of how Bhakti moves from south to north. But it turns out that great story doesn't emerge from the Bhagavata itself. It emerges from the Bhagavata Mahatmya, and the earliest manuscripts of that text can only be dated to the early 18th century. What's going on in the early 18th century? I think what's going on is that a group of Brahmins who live in the north but have a memory of the south are truly pissed at the fact that Kayasts and others have begun to tell the story of the Bhagavata, and they want to reclaim it by the institution of the Bhagavat Saptah. So at 2 points in that text, you're told how to perform a Bhagavat Saptah. And if the description in chapter 3 is not good enough for you, please wait until the one in chapter 6 where they really tell you how it should be done. Fascinating. So I think it's a northern story about the south. And the real place where where you learn what the effects of a Bhagavat Saptah can be is Haridwar. But along the way, Bhakti is rejuvenated in Vrindavan. That's the part of the story we know. But actually it goes on to Haridwar. So that's chapter 2. It complicates the plot. Chapter 3 was supposed to be these 4 sampradayas. Oh dear. So we have to decide who gave us this idea. I think it's Nabadas, but there are 2 competing texts. One is by Kavi Karnapura, Gaudiya, and the other is by a man who's, Dvivedi Gadakya is how he describes himself. He's usually called Gadadhara Bhatt. He is a Vallabhite. They both write texts that are interpreted by their communities as the first iteration of this idea. It's already more complicated than we want. In chapter 3, I try to set that out a little bit and describe what the stakes are for Nabha. And we don't know that he was sitting in Galta, but we do know that he was writing at the time of the expansion of the Mughal realm and the time where the Katwahas, which had recently come to be the royal associate of the monastic community of Rahm Anandis in Galta, where that had become a very strong bond. So I think that we have this picture of the 4 sampradayas as a feature of a general, the projection of empire across a very large area of India. So an important sort of thing to take away from this would be that the idea of the Bhakti movement is never separated from political reality. In its launching, that's always there in some way, though it may not be articulated in the text itself. So that became chapter 3, only part of this original middle chapter. I stopped for a moment then and actually look at the iconic Vrindavan to try to ask, not historiographically now, but historically, what was Vrindavan like actually in the 16th century? And a main message to take away is the Mughal message that Vrindavan could not have come to be. It was a tax-free zone, could not have come to be if it had not been for Akbar and the Mughal state. Obviously, the Kachwahas are deeply involved, but this is the idea of the Bhakti movement as articulated by Nabadas. If there's one Muslim there, it's Kabir. There are no more. But if you look at what actually is being, what seems to be the generating force for this idea, there are lots of Muslims present, and they are very important to the political constitution of the country. So that actually ends up being at the pinnacle of the book. If we're looking for, you know, the Shakespearean moment of peak experience, that's it, the Mughal state. We still have some cleanup work to do with this idea of the four sampradayas, though, and that takes place in the realm of Raja Sawai Jai Singh, beginning of the 18th century, where he tries, on the advice of his advisors, to institute the idea of the four sampradayas as government policy. This is how a proper Vedic state, Vedic/Vaishnava state, should be run. So that's very interesting, and it's at that point, I think, that we have the Chaitanyites and the Vallabhites trying to get on board for the idea of the Sampradaya by writing themselves into this four Sampradaya history. And those are very interesting stories. This gets me into manuscript work, where you have to figure out, okay, why, when is this date claimed? Can it be true or not? And so forth. This is for you. So the manuscripts. The conditions of our knowledge, the conditions of our historical knowledge, unless we go to these sources, we just can't know. We can know some things, but we can't know all things in a way that we really want to. So that's where you started on this extremely important project. Chapter 5. Okay, so finally we're going downhill. We get to Bengal. We see how it all comes together as an idea on the eve of the creation of the nation. And then we have one last chapter. It's become chapter 7, which is supposed to be the denouement chapter. You know, here's how it all comes together in modern time. But oh my God, I just told you about the Tirupati conference. That, for me at least, was not an experience of complete denouement. Here was a conference that was supposed to be organized around this all-embracing idea. I saw only one Muslim scholar in the room. Why was that? Was it because the Bhakti movement is an idea that doesn't seem like home to Muslims? Was it a feature of the fact that those who were doing the organizing didn't have very good connections in Muslim-based institutions? That scholar was brought from Shantiniketan, as a matter of fact. So we were in a different kind of realm than you might have thought we would be in by the time we got to that conference. Was it that Tirupati seemed a very strange place to have this kind of conference if you came from a Muslim background? So these discontents that we talked about in the first chapter don't actually get resolved in contemporary India. This is a fact we know well. And I just try to say something about where we are on the ground now. There would be many things that you would know better than I. Bhakti was certainly invoked in the destruction of the Badri Mosque. It's been invoked in a very different way by Sahmat, of all people, who actually quote from the Hindi Bhavan murals to make a case for a Kabir-based Bhakti movement. These are issues that are being fought still in India today, and are being fought all around the world. With the idea of the Bhakti movement, India is on better footing than the United States is, because you have a nationally articulated sense. Yes, it has very fuzzy borders, but those fuzzy borders in the idea of the Bhakti movement make it possible for different stakeholders, let us say, to enter into the debate of what a Bhakti movement might be. And if it's not a single thing, if it's a thing that has historical roots, okay, then we as a nation are entitled to argue about what the Bhakti movement should be and how we should be a part of it, or whether we should be a part of it, and in fact whether it should be called the Bhakti movement or not. Those kinds of things, I think India, from a religious point of view, is on far better footing to deal with than the United States at this moment in time. Thanks for listening. Okay.
So just a little bit historically, Bhakti as a quote-unquote movement. But Bhakti is also, as you say, a sadhana. And if you go back to the ancient text, Gita, it's a yoga, it's a practice. And yet, we're seeing this kind of romance of the South as the kind of heartland. Why do you suppose this is a Vallabha and so on, that bringing Bhakti to the North as if this was an import that was not there? When you see that?
That's a really great saying. I think it's a Mughal thing that happens in the North. When Navadas puts together his Bhaktamal, he creates a sort of map of, let's call it the history of religions. And at the base, you have 4 versions of divinity, from Vishnu over to Brahma. The second stage is the historical one, where we have Rahm Anand as one of the churches, one of the sampradayas, all the way across to not Vallabha, but Vishnu Swami, about whom we know nothing. You know? So he's sort of picking at straws. We don't know what his sources are, but the interesting thing is that as he issues this sort of call to the South, he doesn't seem to know about the Alvars or the Nayanat. He doesn't seem to know about the Divya Suricharitam at all, or the story. And we don't get any sense of that. The South is an idea when he builds his text, and he lets go of that idea once he gets his own sampradaya established in the North by virtue of Rahm Anand. Then the idea sort of falls away, and he gives us a description of Bhakti as he meets it in his world. It's a very interesting layered text in that way. So to get back to your question, Bob, so what is this about the South? To me, that question is still unanswered. Is this a text, the Bhaktamal, that was created not just as a response to the consolidation of the Mughal state, but also as a way to go beyond that consolidation and to look to some sense of Indianness that is not integrally involved with what was happening in the world of Nava's own time. Something that's not a part of the Kachwaha Mughal alliance. And so the availability of the South to do that kind of work for India as, for Bharatvarsh itself, I wonder if that isn't happening. Another question that's around that is, so why did he try to write this historical work? Was he perhaps influenced by the Tazkirah as a form of history telling? That, we know that if he was in Galta, we don't know that, but he may well have been. Certainly he would have been, Ajmer is not very far away. They're definitely on the road to the centers of Mughal power and certainly Kachwaha power. Tazkirah and Mughal ways of, Islamic ways of telling history must very much have been a part of his world. Is he trying to develop a sort of Hindu Tazkirah? And if you were to do that, how would you do it? Would you necessarily have to involve an image of the entire nation, and would that somehow create the South as being older in time because it's not deeply influenced by the Islamic ecumene that's being built in Mughal time?
2 things. What would you term Bhakti to be? A movement or an andolan?
The answer is easy, neither. But that's too easy an answer.
Right.
I think what's important, andolan is an interesting word, and I don't know Bengali, of course, but I hear that it means something rather different in Bangla than it means in Hindi.
Right.
With Hindi, and you be the authority on this, my sense is that andolan comes into the language as a translation, actually, of the English term, movement. So it's a word that would be interesting to really know more about the history of the word. So the non-coercion cooperation movement and so forth, these are the various andolans that you have in the Hindi language. Apparently that term, which, and so forth, it has a rather different sense of oscillation than we would think if we're thinking about the word movement. And that takes us back another step. What about the word movement itself? At what point in English does the word movement come to be used as if it could be a social movement? I think only in the mid-19th century. So we're dealing, interestingly, here with in a certain way, with a global story, and not just an Indian story. Then, of course, there's the second question of whether these terms are at all adequate to what we're describing, and I do try to at least raise that as a question in the last chapter and suggest that maybe we should think about network as another way of thinking about it, or to pluralize the idea of movement if we want to think of movement. But let's remember that if we give up on the term movement, then we're giving up on a term, or even Angola, then we're giving up on a term that has meant something special to people who have thought of Bhakti as something having to do with social change. Because the analogies to Andolan or movement are cross out of the realm of religion into all sorts of social and politically aware, I don't know what to call them, but movements.
The Andolan in Hindi also carries the meaning of agitation.
Yes.
Deliberate agitation for a specific demand. It's not just a historical movement.
Absolutely.
It's also a deliberate agitation for a specific demand.
Right.
And keeping this
So
connotation,
agitation captures some of the sense of, back and forth, as in a swing, that
Yeah,
would be
and
lost by the term.
keeping that sense in mind, I find the term Bhakti Andolan rather confusing. Because Bhakti Andolan, or whatever it was not an organized, self-consciously organized attempt to achieve a certain political or social demand. In that sense, I have always been feeling uncomfortable with the term Andolan, in the context of Hindi, not in the context of other languages. And so far as your proposal networks is concerned, I am not very satisfied with that also. Because I have been feeling that, as you say, we all are in time. So during the time of Hari Prasad Dwivedi, we were having Swadhinta Andolan. So we had Bhakti Andolan. During the time of Jack Hawley, everybody is creating networks. So we have Bhakti network. So maybe yet the issue you are trying to address, the fact that it was there in all the languages of the subcontinent, it was there in many more very creative moments. So there is something all India, something pan India, something South Asian about this whole phenomenon, which needs to be named. And as I told you, I am not happy with movement, I am not happy with Andolan, and I am not happy with network also. So let us think of some better expression.
With the understanding that whatever we think of is not going to be the right term or set of terms for 50 years from now.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if we can know that,
Right.
if we can recognize ourselves as actors in the process of naming and being aware of what naming means,
Yeah.
or, as you were saying, bringing religion to bear on other issues, that's an important thing to do. If you look in Google and try to find out what the earliest usage in English of the term Bhakti movement is, where does it turn out to be? It's in text, I've forgotten it. It's in the book somewhere. I think her name is Khalid. And she's working with, to do a history of the Rahm Anand. So it's to describe what happened around Keshav. Keshav's understanding.
Yeah.
That is the first instance in English that we have of the use of the term Bhakti movement. So it's a sort of movement, an agitation inside the Brahmo Samaj, which is far away from the Sajias, certainly, but has some sort of unsettling quality to it from the point of view of some. On the other, it seems a sort of Protestantization and emotionalization of what ought to have been more emotional all along. These words are interesting.